June 21, 1942, Tobruk, Libya. The fortress that had held against Rommel for 240 days in 1941 fell in a single morning. 33,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers marched into captivity, surrendering to a German-Italian force roughly half their number. The defensive perimeter that should have anchored the Eighth Army's southern flank collapsed not through overwhelming firepower or brilliant maneuver, but through a breakdown so complete that German commanders initially suspected a trap. There was no trap. There was only an army that had forgotten how to fight as a coordinated force, its components operating in isolation while the enemy concentrated and struck. The news reached Winston Churchill in Washington, where he sat with President Franklin Roosevelt discussing the allocation of American industrial production to the war effort. The message arrived mid-conversation, and Churchill's reaction would be recorded by those present as unlike anything they had witnessed from the Prime Minister. He called it a disgrace. The word inadequately captured what Tobruk represented. In strategic terms, the loss handed Rommel fuel, vehicles, and supplies sufficient to sustain his advance toward Egypt. In psychological terms, it confirmed a pattern that had repeated across 2 years and multiple theaters. The British Army could not defeat German forces of comparable or lesser strength in mobile warfare. The catalogue of failures that preceded Tobruk stretched back to the war's opening campaigns. France in 1940 had been attributed to overwhelming German numbers and the collapse of Allied coordination. Greece and Crete in 1941 offered similar explanations, involving impossible defensive positions and enemy air superiority. But the Western Desert permitted no such rationalizations. British forces in North Africa operated with secure supply lines, adequate armor, and artillery support that frequently exceeded their opponents. They lost anyway. They lost at Gazala in June 1942, when Rommel's Afrika Korps smashed through positions held by units that failed to support one another. They lost in running battles where German battle groups concentrated against isolated British formations with a coordination that seemed almost instinctive. The problem was not courage. British and Commonwealth soldiers had demonstrated throughout the Desert Campaign a willingness to fight that matched any army in the world. Individual units held positions until overrun, launched counterattacks against superior forces, and endured conditions that tested physical and psychological limits. The problem was that courage divorced from tactical competence produced heroic defeats rather than victories. A battalion defending a position without coordinated artillery support would be destroyed regardless of how bravely its soldiers fought. An armored regiment charging enemy anti-tank guns without infantry to suppress them would burn, regardless of its crew's determination. The institutional failures underlying these tactical disasters had accumulated through 2 decades of peacetime neglect and doctrinal stagnation. The British Army that entered the Second World War remained organized around principles developed during the First, modified only superficially by interwar experimentation. Infantry tactics emphasized controlled rifle fire delivered by platoons advancing in extended lines, methods appropriate for the Western Front's static conditions, but catastrophically unsuited to mobile warfare against an enemy who concentrated automatic weapons and armor at decisive points. The coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery that German doctrine treated as fundamental remained in British practice an aspiration rather than a reality. Tank units and infantry divisions trained separately, fought separately, and blamed each other for failures that stemmed from absence of common doctrine. Artillery support requests passed through communication channels so cumbersome that bombardments frequently arrived after the tactical situation had changed entirely. the regimental system that provided British units with exceptional cohesion and fighting spirit simultaneously resisted the standardization necessary for formations to operate interchangeably. A battalion from one regiment could not seamlessly integrate with brigades from another because each maintained distinct procedures developed through decades of independent tradition. The question confronting British military leadership in the summer of 1942 was not whether reform was necessary. The burning vehicles scattered across the western desert answered that question definitively. The question was whether an army could transform its fundamental operating methods while actively engaged against an enemy who had already mastered the techniques that transformation required. The Germans had spent years developing their doctrine through careful experimentation and ruthless evaluation. The British would have to accomplish equivalent change in months under fire, with no guarantee that the lessons learned would arrive before the next disaster. The roots of British tactical dysfunction extended far deeper than the desert campaigns revealed. The army that fought in North Africa had been shaped by 20 years of institutional choices that prioritized economy over capability, tradition over innovation, and imperial policing over continental warfare. Understanding why Tobruk fell required examining not merely the decisions of June 1942, but the accumulated weight of decisions stretching back to the armistice of 1918. The British Army had emerged from the First World War with hard-won expertise in combined arms warfare. The 100 Days Offensive of 1918 demonstrated sophisticated coordination between infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft that shattered German defensive positions across France and Belgium. Officers who survived that campaign understood what synchronized operations could achieve. They also understood that such operations demanded extensive training, detailed planning, and communication systems capable of adjusting fire support as tactical situations evolved. This knowledge existed within the institution. It was not transmitted to the next generation. Peacetime budgets reduced the army to a fraction of its wartime strength, and the missions assigned to that reduced force bore no resemblance to European warfare. Garrisons scattered across India, Egypt, Palestine, and a dozen smaller postings focused on maintaining order among colonial populations, not preparing for mechanized combat against a peer adversary. The skills required for imperial policing were genuinely demanding, but they were not the skills required to defeat German panzer divisions. An officer who spent 15 years managing tribal disputes on the northwest frontier developed expertise irrelevant to the coordination challenges of modern battle. Infantry doctrine calcified around methods that had been innovative in 1917 and were obsolete by 1939. The basic tactical unit remained the platoon advancing in extended line, controlled by whistle signals and voice commands, delivering aimed rifle fire against identified targets. This methodology assumed conditions that mechanized warfare had eliminated: a relatively static front, limited enemy mobility, and engagement ranges measured in hundreds of yards rather than thousands. German infantry had reorganized around the machine gun as the primary killing instrument, with riflemen serving to protect and support automatic weapons. British infantry retained the rifle as primary and the machine gun as supporting, an inversion that left platoons outgunned in every engagement. The Tank Corps that had pioneered armored warfare in 1916 found itself marginalized during the interwar decades by cavalry regiments reluctant to abandon horses and infantry commanders uncertain how armor should integrate with their operations. Mechanization proceeded fitfully, with different formations adopting incompatible doctrines based on whether their commanders envisioned tanks as infantry support weapons, independent exploitation forces, or mobile artillery platforms. No consensus emerged regarding how armor should cooperate with other arms, because no institution existed to develop and enforce such consensus. Artillery, the arm that had dominated the Western Front and would prove decisive in the Second World War, suffered perhaps the most damaging neglect. The sophisticated fire control methods developed by 1918, including predicted fire, counter-battery operations, and creeping barrages timed to infantry movement, required mathematical training and communication equipment that peacetime budgets could not sustain. Forward observation procedures that had become routine in France were forgotten as officers rotated through postings where calling for fire support meant requesting assistance from a single mountain battery rather than coordinating divisional artillery groups. The regimental system compounded every deficiency by fragmenting the army into dozens of semi-independent traditions. Each regiment maintained its own customs, training emphases, and operational procedures, creating an institution where battalions from different regiments could not simply substitute for one another in tactical formations. A commanding officer inherited not merely a military unit, but a historical legacy that constrained adaptation. Changing how a regiment conducted operations meant challenging traditions that officers had absorbed since commissioning, traditions defended by retired colonels, regimental associations, and the accumulated weight of institutional identity. These structural weaknesses might have been addressed through rigorous evaluation and doctrinal reform. The British Army possessed intelligent officers who recognized the problems and proposed solutions. Their proposals encountered an institutional culture that treated the interwar period as an interlude rather than an opportunity. The next war, whenever it came, would be managed through improvisation and native British adaptability. This assumption persisted until the Germans demonstrated what systematic doctrinal development could achieve. August 13, 1942, Cairo, Egypt. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery arrived at 8th Army Headquarters and immediately violated protocol by assuming command a day before his scheduled appointment. The previous commander, Lieutenant General William Gott, had been killed when his transport aircraft was shot down, and Montgomery saw no reason to observe administrative formalities while the Army drifted without direction. His first orders revealed a temperament that would prove as controversial as it was effective. There would be no further retreat. Units would fight and die where they stood rather than execute the withdrawal plans already prepared for a German breakthrough. The psychological effect on an army conditioned to expect defeat was immediate and measurable. Montgomery understood that willpower alone could not reverse the tactical dysfunction that had produced 18 months of failure. What 8th Army required was not inspiration, but methodology, a systematic reconstruction of how formations fought that would transform improvisation into doctrine. The reforms he initiated within days of assuming command addressed the specific coordination failures that had destroyed British positions at Gazala and Tobruk. Armor would no longer operate independently, charging enemy positions while infantry watched from distant defensive boxes. Artillery would no longer respond to support requests through channels that delayed fire until tactical moments had passed. Every element would function as components of an integrated system, coordinated through procedures standardized across the entire army. The concept of the Corps Artillery Plan represented Montgomery's most significant doctrinal innovation. Previous British operations had treated artillery as a divisional asset, with each division controlling its own guns and coordinating loosely with adjacent formations. Montgomery centralized artillery command at corps level, enabling fire controllers to mass dozens of batteries against single targets within minutes of a request. A forward observer identifying an enemy concentration could now call upon firepower that would have required hours to coordinate under the previous system. The Germans had practiced similar concentration since 1939. The British were learning it under pressure of imminent battle. Infantry and armor integration required breaking habits that regimental culture had reinforced for decades. Tank commanders accustomed to operating as independent cavalry forces were informed that they would advance with infantry or not advance. Infantry officers who had regarded tanks as unreliable appendages learned that armor would provide the suppressive firepower their assaults required. The integration was not optional. Montgomery made clear that officers unable to adapt to combined arms doctrine would be replaced by officers who could. Several were, their departures serving notice that tradition offered no protection against operational necessity. The training regime imposed before El Alamein consumed every available hour. Units rehearsed specific attack sequences against mock positions constructed to replicate German defensive layouts. Artillery officers practiced the timing calculations that would walk barrages forward at precise intervals matched to infantry advance rates. Tank crews learned the communication procedures that would summon infantry support when anti-tank guns threatened their advance. Nothing was left to improvisation, because improvisation had killed too many soldiers already. Montgomery's insistence on preparation before offensive action represented a rejection of the opportunistic mentality that had characterized earlier desert operations. Previous commanders had launched attacks when circumstances seemed favorable, trusting that aggressive initiative would overcome incomplete planning. The results had been catastrophic. Montgomery would not attack until every element was positioned, every subordinate briefed, and every contingency addressed. Critics called this methodical approach slow and unimaginative. Montgomery called it professional. The Eighth Army that assembled for El Alamein in October 1942 remained institutionally similar to the force that had surrendered to Tobruk 4 months earlier. The regiments bore the same names, the equipment came from the same factories, and many of the same officers commanded the same units. What had changed was how these elements related to one another. The procedures that connected artillery to infantry to armor in sequences that could be rehearsed, refined, and replicated. The army had not been rebuilt, it had been reorganized around principles that German commanders considered fundamental for years. The revolution Montgomery initiated would require another 18 months to penetrate the entire British military establishment. At El Alamein, it would receive its first validation. The reforms Montgomery implemented in Egypt addressed immediate operational failures, but transforming an entire army required institutions capable of propagating new methods across hundreds of units scattered from Scotland to Burma. The battle school system that emerged through late 1942 and 1943 became the mechanism through which tactical revolution reached every infantry battalion in the British order of battle. These establishments did not merely train soldiers, they dismantled assumptions about warfare that had survived 2 decades of institutional inertia and rebuilt tactical understanding from fundamental principles. GHQ Battle School at Barnard Castle in County Durham became the prototype for a network that would eventually span the empire. The facility occupied grounds that permitted realistic terrain exercises impossible at traditional training depots, with instructors drawn from officers who had experienced the desert campaigns firsthand. What distinguished Barnard Castle from previous training establishments was its explicit rejection of ceremonial preparation in favor of combat simulation. Soldiers arriving for courses discovered that parade ground drill had been eliminated entirely. The precision marching that had consumed countless hours at regimental depots served no purpose in battle schools focused exclusively on killing efficiency. The curriculum that emerged reflected painful lessons from North Africa, Crete, and the failed Dieppe raid of August 1942. Infantry sections learned fire and maneuver tactics that treated the Bren light machine gun as the primary killing instrument rather than a supplement to rifle fire. A section advancing against an enemy position would establish a base of fire with the Bren, while rifle teams maneuvered to flanking positions, a methodology German infantry had employed since 1939, but British doctrine had never formalized. The drills were practiced until they became instinctive, repeated across varying terrain until soldiers executed them without conscious deliberation. Live ammunition transformed training from theatrical exercise into visceral preparation. Battle school courses incorporated firing ranges where soldiers advanced under machine gun fire directed inches above their heads, experiencing the psychological reality of bullets passing nearby without the sanitized abstraction of blank rounds. The danger was genuine. Accidents occurred, and soldiers died in training at rates that peacetime safety standards would have prohibited. Commanders accepted these casualties as necessary investment against the far greater losses that inadequately prepared troops would suffer in combat. Street fighting instruction addressed the urban warfare challenges that would dominate operations from Sicily through northwest Europe. Purpose-built villages allowed units to practice room-clearing techniques, grenade employment in confined spaces, and the coordination problems that arose when platoons fought through three-dimensional environments where threats could emerge from any direction. The catastrophic losses at Dieppe had demonstrated that amphibious assault against defended positions required specialized preparation that no previous British training had provided. Battle schools developed curricula specifically addressing the transition from landing craft to hostile shore. Cooperation training with armor and artillery occupied substantial portions of every course. Infantry officers learned to read tank capabilities and limitations, understanding which terrain favored armored support and which negated it. They practiced the communication procedures that summoned artillery fire, discovering through repeated exercise how quickly supporting bombardments could arrive when proper channels were employed. Tank crews attended reciprocal courses, learning how infantry could protect them from the close-range anti-tank weapons that had destroyed so many vehicles operating without dismounted support. The institutional resistance that had preserved outdated methods for decades could not withstand the battle school system's expansion. By mid-1943, every infantry division rotating through the United Kingdom underwent battle school training that standardized tactical procedures across regimental boundaries. The distinctive methods that individual regiments had maintained as marks of identity gave way to common doctrine that permitted battalions from different formations to integrate seamlessly. A platoon commander from a county regiment now employed identical fire and maneuver drills as his counterpart from a guards battalion, enabling operational flexibility that modern warfare demanded. The transformation extended beyond tactical mechanics to psychological preparation. Battle schools emphasized aggression and initiative at small unit level, qualities that previous training had subordinated to discipline and obedience. Section commanders learned to exploit opportunities without awaiting orders from above, trusting their judgment within the framework that doctrine provided. The British infantry soldier of 1944 would enter combat with preparation incomparably superior to his predecessor of 1940, trained not for the war that institutions had imagined, but for the war that experience had revealed. The revolution in infantry tactics required corresponding transformation in the arm that would determine whether attacks succeeded or failed before the first soldier crossed the start line. Artillery had dominated European battlefields since 1914, and the British Army that emerged from the First World War possessed genuine expertise in massed fire coordination. That expertise had atrophied through 2 decades of colonial deployments, where a battery of mountain guns represented exceptional firepower. Reconstructing the fire control systems that had shattered German defenses in 1918 became the essential complement to battle school reforms, and the officers who accomplished this reconstruction worked with an urgency born from watching unsupported infantry die across North Africa. The fundamental problem was communication speed. An artillery battery could deliver devastating firepower against any target within range, but only if that target's coordinates reached the guns while the enemy remained stationary. The request channels employed during the desert campaigns routed fire missions through multiple headquarters, each adding delay while officers verified authorization and checked coordination with adjacent units. A forward observer identifying a target might wait 15 or 20 minutes for responding fire, an eternity in mobile warfare where German formations could displace in a fraction of that time. The targets had moved, the shells fell on empty ground. Infantry died because the system that should have protected them operated at speeds incompatible with modern combat. The solution that emerged through 1943 centralized fire control while distributing observation capability. Corps artillery headquarters assumed authority to mass fires from multiple divisions without the coordination delays that fragmented response had required. A single fire direction center could command dozens of batteries, concentrating firepower that previous doctrine had dispersed across independent divisional channels. The mathematics of this concentration proved formidable. A British infantry division possessed 72 25-pounder guns in its organic artillery regiments. A corps controlling 3 divisions could theoretically mass over 200 guns against a single target, delivering roughly 4,000 pounds of high explosive per minute onto an area measured in hundreds of yards. Radio networks made this concentration tactically relevant. Forward observation officers attached to infantry battalions received equipment that connected them directly to Corps fire direction centers, bypassing the headquarters layers that had previously delayed every request. An observer identifying a target could transmit coordinates and receive responding fire within 3 minutes under optimal conditions, a reduction from the 15-minute delays that had rendered artillery support operationally meaningless. The technical requirements for this speed demanded mathematical precision that transformed artillery from craft into science. Predicted fire techniques eliminated the ranging chutes that had previously announced every bombardment. Traditional methods required batteries to fire ranging rounds at known points, adjusting aim until shells fell accurately before shifting to actual targets. The process consumed time and sacrificed surprise, warning defenders that attack was imminent. Predicted fire calculated trajectories from meteorological data, muzzle velocity measurements, and survey coordinates precise enough that first rounds landed on target without preliminary adjustment. The mathematical tables required for these calculations filled volumes, and the officers who mastered them underwent training as rigorous as any technical specialty in the army. The timed barrage that had characterized 1918 offensives returned in refined form. Artillery programs for major attacks specified exactly when shells would impact specific grid coordinates, creating walls of fire that advanced at rates matched to infantry movement. A soldier knew that the barrage lifting from his objective would shift to the next defensive line precisely 90 seconds after he crossed the start line, provided he maintained the advance speed that planning assumed. The coordination demanded meticulous synchronization between artillery planners and infantry commanders, the kind of detailed preparation that Montgomery had imposed before El Alamein and that battle schools now propagated throughout the army. German artillery officers observing British methods by 1944 recognized capabilities that exceeded their own declining systems. fuel shortages, and disrupted communications had degraded German fire coordination precisely as British systems achieved unprecedented integration. The arm that had supported German combined arms dominance through 4 years of victories could no longer mass fires with the speed and precision that British corps artillery demonstrated routinely. The revolution in gunnery would reach its fullest expression on beaches where preliminary bombardments suppressed defensive positions with accuracy that 1942's gunners could not have imagined. The coordination between artillery and infantry addressed half of the integration problem that had destroyed British formations across North Africa. The other half concerned armor and the institutional barriers separating tank units from infantry divisions proved even more resistant to reform than the communication failures that had fragmented fire support. Tanks and infantry had operated as distinct arms since the 1920s, developing separate doctrines, separate training establishments, and separate conceptions of how battles should unfold. Unifying these perspectives into coherent combined arms methodology required dismantling assumptions that officers had absorbed throughout their careers. The disaster at Gazala in May 1942 illustrated the consequences of doctrinal separation with painful clarity. British armor had engaged Rommel's forces in a series of uncoordinated attacks that permitted German anti-tank guns to destroy tank regiments in detail, while infantry watched from defensive positions miles distant. The tanks charged without infantry to suppress the gun crews killing them. The infantry held ground without armor to break the encirclements forming around them. Each arm blamed the other for failures that stemmed from absence of common operational concept. Tank officers accused infantry commanders of abandoning them. Infantry officers accused tank commanders of abandoning them. Both accusations contained truth, and both missed the fundamental problem. The integration that emerged through 1943 began with organizational changes that placed armor and infantry under unified command at levels where tactical coordination actually occurred. The independent armored divisions that had operated as separate formations gave way to mixed establishments where tank brigades worked permanently with infantry brigades, training together, planning together, and fighting together as habitual partners. A tank squadron commander learned the capabilities and limitations of specific infantry companies. An infantry battalion commander understood which tank troops would support his attacks. The relationships that German doctrine had institutionalized through years of peacetime development were being constructed under operational pressure. Training exercises enforced cooperation that organizational charts alone could not guarantee. Combined arms rehearsals brought tank crews and infantry sections together on ranges where they practiced the mutual support that combat demanded. Infantry learned to advance behind tanks, using armored hulls as mobile cover while suppressing anti-tank weapons that threatened the vehicles protecting them. Tank crews learned to pause their advance when infantry fell behind, recognizing that unsupported armor became vulnerable armor, regardless of how rapidly it could move. The drills continued until the coordination became reflexive, tank and infantry moving as integrated elements rather than parallel forces. Major General Percy Hobart's contribution to the tactical revolution addressed specialized challenges that conventional armor could not overcome. Hobart, recalled from retirement and Home Guard service despite Churchill's personal intervention being required to overcome institutional resistance to his abrasive personality, commanded the 79th Armored Division with a mandate to develop equipment for the amphibious assault everyone knew was coming. The vehicles his division produced would be called Hobart's Funnies, a designation that obscured their operational significance. These were not novelties, but solutions to specific tactical problems that had killed soldiers at Dieppe and would kill many more on any defended coastline. The DD tank, fitted with canvas flotation screens and propellers, could swim ashore from landing craft, providing armored support in the critical minutes when infantry were most vulnerable. The Crab, a Sherman fitted with a rotating drum of chains, could clear paths through minefields at speeds that matched infantry advance. The AVRE carried a massive petard mortar capable of destroying concrete fortifications that conventional tank guns could not penetrate. The Crocodile replaced the Hull machine gun with a flamethrower fed from an armored trailer, capable of projecting burning fuel 80 yards into defensive positions. Each vehicle addressed problems that had previously required infantry to solve with grenades and bayonets, problems whose solutions had cost hundreds of lives per operation. The training regime Hobart imposed matched Montgomery's standards for preparation. Crews practiced amphibious launches until they could deploy in any sea state. Engineers rehearsed breaching operations against obstacle replications built from intelligence photographs of the Atlantic Wall. The 79th Armored Division would not fight as a division. Its specialized squadrons would be distributed across the assault forces, providing capabilities that no conventional formation possessed. The preparation consumed months that staff officers sometimes questioned. Hobart's response remained consistent. His crews would be ready or they would not deploy. June 6, 1944. The English Channel, shortly before dawn. 3 British and Canadian divisions approached coastlines that German engineers had spent 4 years fortifying. The soldiers cramped aboard landing craft had rehearsed this assault through months of exercises on British beaches selected for their resemblance to Normandy terrain. They knew which units would land on which sectors, which tanks would support which infantry companies, and which artillery concentrations would suppress which defensive positions. The comprehensive preparation that Montgomery had demanded before El Alamein had become institutional standard, applied now to an operation whose complexity dwarfed anything the desert campaigns had attempted. The bombardment that preceded the landings demonstrated how completely artillery doctrine had transformed. Naval guns and rocket ships delivered preliminary fires calculated to neutralize specific strong points identified through aerial reconnaissance and intelligence analysis. As landing craft approached the shore, field artillery positioned on modified vessels fired concentrations timed to lift precisely as infantry reached the waterline. Forward observation officers landed with the assault waves, carrying radio equipment that connected them to fire direction centers aboard command ships. The system that had failed repeatedly across North Africa functioned with precision that suppressed German defensive fires during the critical minutes when soldiers were most exposed. Hobart's specialized armor proved its value within the operation's first hours. DD tanks launched from landing craft swam toward gold and sword beaches, emerging from the surf to engage German positions while infantry still waded through the shallows. Crab flail tanks cleared lanes through minefields that would have stalled conventional armor and channeled infantry into killing zones. AVRE vehicles advanced against concrete fortifications, their petard mortars destroying bunkers that small arms could not penetrate. Crocodile flamethrowers broke resistance at strong points where defenders might otherwise have fought for hours. The specialized equipment that skeptics had dismissed as Hobart's eccentricities was saving lives measured in hundreds. The infantry that followed this armor ashore moved with tactical coherence that reflected 2 years of battle school instruction. Sections employed fire and maneuver drills practiced until they required no conscious thought, Bren gunners establishing suppressive fire while rifle teams flanked defensive positions. Platoon commanders made decisions without awaiting orders from company headquarters, exploiting opportunities within the doctrinal framework their training had established. The initiative that German infantry had demonstrated since 1939 now characterized British soldiers who had learned through systematic preparation what their opponents had developed through years of operational experience. The contrast with earlier amphibious operations revealed the revolution's scope. Dieppe in August 1942 had cost over 3,000 casualties in a single morning, tanks immobilized on the beach, while infantry died against positions that naval bombardment had failed to suppress. The coordination failures that produced that disaster had been systematically eliminated through reforms that touched every arm and every echelon. Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches were secured by noon, with casualties far below planning estimates, not because German defenses were weak, but because the assault forces executed doctrine designed specifically to overcome those defenses. The transformation had occurred without the dramatic visibility that accompanied command changes or technological breakthroughs. No single innovation explained the difference between the army that surrendered Tobruk and the army that established lodgment in Normandy. The revolution emerged from accumulated institutional reforms, from battle schools that retrained infantry sections, from artillery networks that compressed response times, from armor-infantry integration enforced through habitual partnership, from specialized equipment developed against specific tactical problems. Each element contributed incrementally. Together, they produced an army capable of sustained offensive operations against the most formidable military force in Europe. The officers who had driven this transformation received little contemporary recognition. Their work lacked the narrative appeal of battlefield heroics or strategic genius. They had built training curricula, written doctrinal manuals, and supervised exercises whose repetitive nature obscured their cumulative significance. The British Army that fought from Normandy to the Baltic did so employing methods these officers had systematized, methods that converted courage into capability and determination into tactical effect. The revolution remained silent because its architects understood that institutional change required no audience, only results. The results spoke on beaches where soldiers who would have died in 1942 survived, advanced, and prevailed.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com